What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors walks onto a talk show expecting a conversation and instead gets ambushed by a host who seems more interested in controversy than respect? In just 33 seconds of one comment, Tamron Hall would turn what should have been a respectful interview into a train wreck that ended with Denzel Washington walking off her set, leaving behind a studio in complete shock. This wasn't supposed to go this way. Denzel Washington had agreed to appear on the Tamron Hall show to discuss his latest film project, something he'd been passionate about for years. The audience was packed, the cameras were rolling, and everyone expected the kind of thoughtful, inspiring conversation Denzel was known for giving. But from the very first moment he sat down, something felt off. Tamron Hall came out with an energy that seemed less welcoming and more combative. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes, and there was an edge in her voice that made even the audience shift uncomfortably in their seats. Denzel, ever the professional, settled into his chair and greeted her warmly, trying to set a positive tone. "Denzel, thank you so much for being here." Tamron started, but before he could even respond properly, she cut him off. "I have to say, I'm surprised you actually showed up today." The audience went quiet. That wasn't a normal way to greet a guest. Denzel's eyebrows raised slightly, but he kept his composure. "Well, I said I would be here, so here I am. I'm excited to talk about the film." But Tamron wasn't interested in the film. Not yet. Instead, she leaned forward with that look the one talk show hosts get when they think they're about to get a viral moment. "Before we get to that, I want to address something. There's been a lot of talk about you lately. People are saying you're difficult to work with, that you're demanding on set. What do you say to those critics?" Denzel's face remained calm, but you could see the slight tightening around his eyes. This wasn't what they discussed before the show. This wasn't what he'd agreed to talk about. "I think," he began carefully, "that anyone who's actually worked with me would tell you that I'm passionate about the work. I care about getting things right. If that's difficult, then I guess I'm guilty." It was a gracious answer, the kind of response that should have allowed them to move on, but Tamron wasn't letting it go. "So you admit you're difficult," she pressed, twisting his words in a way that made several audience members gasp quietly. "That's not what I said," Denzel replied, his voice still even but firmer now. "I said I'm passionate. There's a difference." Tamron sat back in her chair with a smirk that suggested she thought she was winning some kind of battle. "Well, passion can look a lot like ego from the outside, can it?" The atmosphere in the studio changed completely. This wasn't an interview anymore. This was an attack, and everyone could feel it. Denzel took a slow breath, clearly trying to maintain his professionalism. "I came here to talk about a film that means a lot to me and to a lot of other people who worked on it. If we could focus on that, I'd appreciate it." "Oh, we'll get to the film," Tamron said dismissively, waving her hand like his request was an inconvenience. "But I think my audience deserves to know who they're really watching. They deserve the truth about who Denzel Washington is when the cameras aren't rolling." "The cameras are rolling right now," Denzel pointed out, his patience clearly wearing thin. "And what you're seeing is exactly who I am. Someone who respects the work and respects the people I work with." Tamron laughed, but it wasn't a genuine laugh. It was mocking. "That's a great line. Did you rehearse that? Because it sounds like something from one of your movies." The audience was no longer just uncomfortable. Some of them were starting to look angry on Denzel's behalf. This was supposed to be a celebration of an incredible actor's work, not a roast session, but Tamron seemed completely unaware of or unconcerned by the shifting mood in the room. Denzel leaned forward slightly. "I think maybe we got off on the wrong foot here. Why don't we start over? I'd love to tell your audience about the film and what it means." For a brief moment, it seemed like Tamron might take the olive branch, but instead, she doubled down. "You know what I find interesting, Denzel? You have this image of being this dignified, respectable figure in Hollywood. But I've heard stories. I've heard that you can be condescending, that you talk down to people, especially to women." The accusation hung in the air like a bomb. The audience audibly reacted, some gasping, others murmuring in disbelief. This wasn't just unprofessional anymore. This was character assassination on live television. Denzel's jaw tightened, and for the first time, real anger flashed across his face. "That is absolutely not true," he said, his voice low and controlled but vibrating with barely contained frustration. "I have never, ever disrespected anyone based on their gender or anything else. That's a serious accusation to make without any evidence." Tamron shrugged, as if she'd just commented on the weather. "I'm just saying what I've heard. And where there's smoke, there's usually fire, right?" "No," Denzel said firmly. Sometimes where there's smoke, there's just someone trying to start a fire where there isn't one. And I'm not going to sit here and let you do that. But Tamron wasn't backing down. If anything, she seemed energized by his pushback. So you're saying everyone who's ever had a problem with you is lying? That seems a little convenient, doesn't it? A little arrogant, maybe? I'm saying, Denzel replied, his voice rising slightly now, that you invited me here under false pretenses. We agreed to discuss my film. Instead, you're sitting here making accusations and trying to paint me as someone I'm not. Why? What's the point of this? Tamron leaned back with a satisfied expression, like she'd been waiting for him to ask that question. The point, Denzel, is that I'm not one of these hosts who's going to kiss up to celebrities just because they're famous. I ask the hard questions. I hold people accountable. Accountable for what? Denzel shot back. For working hard? For caring about my craft? For treating people with respect? Because that's what I do. And if you had any actual evidence of anything different, you would have presented it by now, instead of hiding behind vague rumors and innuendo. The audience started clapping, supporting Denzel. But Tamron raised her hand to quiet them. Her face had hardened now, the pretense of a friendly interview completely abandoned. I don't appreciate being lectured on my own show, she said coldly. And I don't appreciate being ambushed, Denzel countered. I've done thousands of interviews in my career. I've sat down with journalists who've asked tough questions, who've challenged me, who've made me think. But this isn't journalism. This is just mean-spirited. Tamron's eyes flashed. Mean-spirited? Because I won't treat you like you walk on water? Because I won't pretend you're perfect? No, Denzel said, standing up now. Mean-spirited because you're not interested in the truth. You're interested in tearing someone down for ratings, and I'm not going to participate in that. The studio went dead silent. A guest standing up during an interview was shocking enough, but everyone could sense that something bigger was about to happen. Tamron stood up too, her face flushed with anger. Sit down, Denzel. We're not finished here. Yes, we are, Denzel said calmly, reaching up to remove his microphone. I came here in good faith. I was ready to have a real conversation, but you're not interested in that, so I'm done. Tamron's voice went up an octave, desperation creeping in as she realized she was losing control of the situation. You can't just walk off my show. Do you know how entitled that makes you look? Denzel paused, turning to look at her directly. Entitled? I'm entitled because I won't sit here and be disrespected, because I won't let you spread lies about me to your audience. That's not entitlement. That's self-respect, and it's something everyone should have, whether they're famous or not. He started walking toward the exit, but Tamron wasn't done. Her voice echoed through the studio, shrill and indignant. This is exactly what I'm talking about. This is the ego. You think you're too good to be questioned. You think you're too important to be held accountable. Denzel stopped and turned around one last time. The cameras were still rolling, capturing every moment. I've been held accountable my entire career, he said quietly but firmly. By directors, by critics, by audiences. I've answered hard questions. I've admitted mistakes. I've grown and learned. But what you're doing right now isn't about accountability. It's about spectacle, and I won't be part of it. Tamron's face was bright red now, her hands clenched at her sides. If you walk out that door, everyone's going to know what kind of person you really are. They're going to see that you can't handle criticism, that you're a coward. The audience gasped at that word. Calling Denzel Washington, a man who'd portrayed some of the bravest characters in cinema history, a coward? It was beyond the pale. Even some of the crew members looked shocked. Denzel just shook his head slowly, a sad smile crossing his face. If that's what you need to tell yourself, then go ahead, he said. But the truth is going to come out. The people watching this right now can see exactly what happened here. They can judge for themselves who was trying to have a real conversation and who was trying to create drama. He turned back toward the exit, and this time he didn't stop. Tamron called after him, her voice cracking now. You're making a huge mistake. You're going to regret this. Denzel, get back here. But he kept walking. The audience sat in stunned silence as one of the biggest stars in Hollywood walked off the set, his dignity intact even as the host behind him seemed to be unraveling. The camera operators didn't know what to do, panning between Tamron's furious face and Denzel's retreating figure. As Denzel reached the exit, he paused for just a moment and looked back at the audience, not at Tamron. I'm sorry you all had to witness that, he said sincerely. You deserved better, and I hope you get to see the film. A lot of good people worked really hard on it. And then he was gone. The door closed behind him with a soft click that somehow seemed deafening in the silent studio. For a long moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The audience just stared at Tamron, who stood frozen on her stage, clearly not having expected things to go this way. Finally, someone in the audience started clapping. Then another person joined in. Then another. Within seconds, most of the audience was applauding, and it clearly wasn't for Tamron. They were showing support for Denzel, for his decision to walk away, for refusing to be treated that way. Tamron's face went through a series of expressions: shock, anger, confusion, and finally, something that might have been the first hint of realization that she'd made a terrible mistake. But she tried to recover, plastering on a fake smile and speaking to the cameras. Well, that was certainly unexpected. I guess some people just can't handle being asked the tough questions. But her words fell flat. The audience had stopped clapping, but they weren't applauding her attempt to spin the situation. They just sat there, cold and silent. Even her own crew looked uncomfortable. The energy in the room had completely turned against her, and no amount of backpedaling was going to fix it. One audience member, a woman in the third row, stood up. "That was disgraceful," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "He came here to talk about his work and you attacked him. You should be ashamed." Other audience members murmured their agreement. Tamron tried to maintain control. "Ma'am, I understand you're upset, but we're all upset," another audience member chimed in, a man this time. "That was one of the most disrespectful things I've ever seen on television. He tried to be polite. He tried to redirect the conversation, and you just kept attacking him." Tamron's fake smile was cracking now. "I was doing my job. I was asking questions that nobody asked you to ask," a third audience member interrupted. "We came here to see Denzel Washington talk about his film. Instead, we watched you try to humiliate him, and he handled it with more grace than you deserved." The murmurs of agreement were growing louder. Tamron looked desperately at her producers off stage, but they seemed just as lost as she was. This wasn't something they could fix with a commercial break. This wasn't something they could edit out later. This had happened live, in front of a studio audience and whoever was watching at home. "I think," Tamron said, her voice shaking slightly now, "we need to take a break. We'll be right back." But as the cameras cut and the lights dimmed slightly, the damage was already done. The audience members were talking among themselves, many of them shaking their heads in disgust. Some were getting up to leave, not willing to stay for the rest of the show. The excitement and energy that had filled the studio when Denzel first walked out had been completely replaced by an uncomfortable, angry tension. Backstage, the scene was equally chaotic. Denzel had been shown to his dressing room, where his team was waiting. They'd watched the whole thing on monitors, and they were furious. His publicist was already on the phone, likely doing damage control, though it wasn't clear what damage there was to control. From everything they'd seen, Denzel had handled the situation perfectly. "Are you okay?" his assistant asked, handing him a bottle of water. Denzel nodded, though he looked tired. "I'm fine. I couldn't stay there. I couldn't let her keep saying those things without any pushback." "You did the right thing," his publicist said, covering the phone with her hand. "Everyone's already talking about it, and the response is overwhelmingly in your favor. People are outraged at how she treated you." Denzel sat down heavily in a chair. "I didn't want it to go that way. I really didn't. I was ready to talk about the film, to share the stories behind it, to give her audience something meaningful. But she had a different agenda from the start." Back in the studio, Tamron was having a heated conversation with her producers. Even from a distance, it was clear things weren't going well. She kept gesturing emphatically, her face still flushed, while the producers looked grim. They knew this was a disaster. They knew that instead of getting a great interview with a legendary actor, they'd captured one of the most uncomfortable moments in talk show history. The audience members who'd stayed were checking their phones, and their reactions suggested that news of the walkout was already spreading. Social media was likely exploding with takes and opinions. Video clips were probably already being shared. This was going to be the story everyone talked about. One of the producers finally walked over to the audience to make an announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have to end today's taping early. We apologize for the inconvenience. Please see our staff on your way out about rescheduling." The audience barely reacted. Most of them seemed relieved to leave. As they filed out, many of them were still talking about what they'd witnessed. "I can't believe she called him a coward," one woman was saying to her friend. "He's Denzel Washington. Show some respect." "She was trying to make a name for herself by taking him down," her friend replied. "But it backfired completely. She just made herself look terrible." In his dressing room, Denzel was preparing to leave. He'd removed the minimal makeup they'd applied for the cameras and changed back into the clothes he'd arrived in. His team had already called for a car, and security had confirmed a route that would let them exit without having to go back through the studio. "Do you want to make a statement?" his publicist asked. Denzel thought about it for a moment, then shook his head. "No. What happened in there speaks for itself. People saw what they saw. I don't need to explain it or justify it. I just want to go home." As he gathered his things, there was a knock on the dressing room door. His assistant opened it to find one of the show's producers standing there, looking deeply uncomfortable. "Mr. Washington, I just wanted to apologize. That interview was not supposed to go that way. We had discussed specific topics, and Miss Hall went completely off script. On behalf of the entire production team, I'm truly sorry." Denzel looked at the producer for a long moment. "I appreciate that. I know this wasn't your fault, but you might want to have a conversation with your host about the difference between asking tough questions and being disrespectful. There's a way to challenge someone that's still professional. What happened out there, wasn't it?" The producer nodded, looking miserable. "I understand. And again, I'm sorry. You deserved better." After the producer left, Denzel's team helped him gather the last of his belongings. As they prepared to leave through the back exit, Denzel paused and looked back toward where the studio was. "You know what the sad part is?" he said quietly. "That film we were supposed to talk about? It's really good. It has something important to say. And now that conversation is going to be overshadowed by this circus." His publicist put a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We'll find other platforms, other shows that will actually want to talk about the work. This doesn't have to define the press tour." Denzel smiled slightly. "You're right. Let's get out of here." They made their way through the back corridors of the studio, past crew members who either looked away awkwardly or gave Denzel small nods of support. When they finally emerged into the late afternoon sunlight, the waiting car was there, ready to take him away from what had been one of the strangest and most uncomfortable experiences of his long career. As the car pulled away from the studio, Denzel looked out the window at the building disappearing behind them. He'd walked into that building a few hours ago, expecting a normal day of promotion. He'd walked out having taken a stand for his own dignity and respect. It wasn't how he'd planned to spend his afternoon, but as he settled back into his seat, he felt at peace with his decision. Because at the end of the day, some things are more important than playing nice for the cameras. Some things are worth walking away from. And if there was one thing Denzel Washington had learned in his decades in Hollywood, it was that you never, ever compromise who you are just to make someone else's show more interesting. The conversation in the car was quiet. His team knew he needed space to process what had happened. They'd debrief later, figure out next steps, plan how to move forward with the rest of the press tour. But for now, they just let him sit with his thoughts. Back at the studio, Tamron was in her office, door closed, having what sounded like a very difficult conversation on the phone. Her staff moved quietly through the halls, speaking in hushed tones. Everyone knew that what had happened today was going to have consequences. You don't ambush and disrespect someone like Denzel Washington and expect it to just blow over. The audience members who'd been there were already posting about their experience. "Just watched Denzel Washington walk off Tamron Hall show, and honestly, good for him," one tweet read. "She was incredibly disrespectful from the moment he sat down. He tried to keep it professional, and she just kept attacking." Another post said, "I was in the audience for the Tamron Hall show today. What you're seeing in the clips doesn't even capture how uncomfortable it was in that room. Denzel was a class act. The host was out of line. The consensus was clear and overwhelming. The public wasn't buying any attempt to spin this as Denzel being difficult or unable to handle tough questions. They'd seen exactly what happened. They'd watched a respected actor try to have a dignified conversation while being repeatedly attacked and disrespected by a host who seemed more interested in creating conflict than conducting an actual interview." As evening fell and Denzel finally arrived home, he sat on his porch for a while, just thinking. His phone had been blowing up with messages of support from friends, colleagues, and even people he hadn't spoken to in years. Everyone wanted him to know they had his back, that they'd seen what happened, that he'd done the right thing. But Denzel wasn't thinking about vindication or public opinion. He was thinking about that moment when he'd stood up and removed his microphone. That moment when he decided enough was enough. That moment when he'd chosen his self-respect over finishing an interview that had gone completely off the rails. And he knew, without a doubt, that he'd made the right choice. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply walk away. Not with anger, not with theatrics, but with quiet dignity and the knowledge that you deserve better. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Denzel took a deep breath and finally smiled. Tomorrow would bring new interviews, new opportunities to talk about the work he loved. But today? Today, he'd reminded everyone, including himself, that no platform, no show, no audience was worth compromising your integrity, and that was a lesson worth learning, even if it came in the most unexpected way possible.